Chicago at 7th Street Theater, and later gave up her career to have, I am serious, 5 children. And in her honor, I felt it was good to bring something that represented the kind of person she was, and also gave you an idea why I would dedicate this session to her, and that is due to the fact that not only was she a character actress, but we're talking about Esther. And Esther is a story that in Jewish tradition every year gets retold in the most ridiculously funny and hilarious ways you possibly can do that. Now, you all know that I make my own kippot, and that sometimes they have a little kind of flirtatious attitude. Now close your eyes, please. You may open your eyes. If this hat is not my sister, I don't know what is. And so, for that reason, I thought I'd bring it and give you a sense of where we're going to go today. We've got it? Thank you. 30 seconds. All right, 30 seconds before we actually start. The people who this is streamed to have missed the best part of the program. Just saying. But for all of you who might be interested, I've just been talking to Chuck about coming sometime just to sing with you. Typically, at other churches, sometimes I have more time. I bring my guitar. We do a little bit of singing. We've never had that time here. And I thought it would be fun for you to learn some ways that Jewish prayers sound and how we sing, and you'll find that there are some similarities in the wording, in the presentation, in the way of thinking, and there are complete lack of similarities in the chord structures, because in our world we like minor chords. Yeah. All right, are we ready to go? I hope so. Let's find out. Last week we talked already a little bit about things in Bible, the way Bible looks, the kinds of literary genres we find in Bible. So this slide is just to remind you, if you were here last week, and to introduce you, if you weren't, to the fact that Hebrew Bible has so many different kinds of genres in it, from mythology to poetry and even to song. In Numbers, there's a lovely moment where people sing about a well. I am not kidding. They ask the well to sing with them. It's probably an ancient song that crept in, but there's also the Song of the Sea that some of you will remember, and the song that Miriam sings. Literary genres of all kind characterize this world. And I also made a point of telling you that in the ancient world, these texts were performed. The one book that I didn't add last week, because I just spoke to you about the way Psalms was presented and on a stage, and the Song of Songs was sung in. Anybody remember, where did we find the Song of Songs recited? In ancient bars. Ask the rabbis, they write about it. Lamentations was a performative genre across the ancient Near East, typically women being the ones who would be often involved in the performance of lament and poetry of lament, and of course Esther. So another thing that I asked you to think about was, what actually is burlesque? What does it look like? What are its features? And they are on this slide to remind you, because as we go through some of the aspects of Esther, I'll ask you to remember these things. Remember the issue of ridicule and caricature. Remember the way that we have role reversals in texts. We discussed all of this last week in this context of two Genesis stories. We'll do that today in the context of the book of Esther. I'm not sure any of you know how hostile Martin Luther was to this particular book, but I thought it might interest you to know. And why? Why does he write these things about the book? He does this for two reasons. One, which is rather unpleasant and has to do with his attitude towards Jews in general. I'm not sure how many of you knew that he wrote one of the earliest and most virulent anti-Semitic tracts that we have in the Middle Ages, called Concerning the Jews and Their Lies. So that is one part of the piece. But another part of the piece is due to the idea that Bible should be serious, and Bible should be pious, and Bible should never, ever be humorous or licentious or ribald, right? That is, in fact, the idea. I think most of us learn in Sunday school about a Bible that is a very serious set of texts and never presented to us as a text of humor or burlesque, because that would make it in some way less holy. I'm here to tell you that we are human, and laughter is human, and having laughter in sacred texts is a real gift, and appreciating it is a joy. So let's just take a look for a moment. How did Esther get into the canon at all? Now, I mentioned last week that your Esther is different than my Esther, because you have a later version that has been rewritten, and that version has cleaned up a lot of stuff, has made Esther more pious, includes the name of God, right? She does the right thing in terms of what she eats and what she doesn't eat. When I say Esther eats treif, that's a Jewish version for, she's not keeping kosher. She's eating the wrong stuff. Okay? So as far as we know in the Jewish version of this text, because nothing is said about this, she goes to the palace and eats everything that's there, and nothing says she avoids any particular foods that she's not supposed to be eating. Nothing says that she is clearly making sure that she doesn't eat milk with meat, right? All of that doesn't come up, so it's an interesting piece. Jews mourn and fast in this text, but never is the word prayer mentioned. That's an interesting fact, right? Again, in your version, you will have prayer mentioned. And sex and sexual allusions are absolutely everywhere, everywhere. I give you just an automatic example. Does anybody remember what happens when Esther has to go to the king and ask for his help? She'll die, right? If he doesn't do what? If he doesn't do what? What does he have to do to spare her life? Yes. Jeannie has done her homework. Point the scepter right at her.
And then she has to touch it.
You bet she has to touch it. She has to touch the tip of the scepter. And the Hebrew is pretty explicit about that. Now, all of you just take a moment to consider what that means and what kind of illusion we are having. So these kinds of sexual illusions happen in the Hebrew throughout this book. And likely because this book is meant as a humorous text, that is probably the reason why we do not have God's name in it. Right? That is almost certainly the rationale, because you might feel a little uncomfortable about putting God's name in a book that is clearly a little bit ribald. It's not PG, it's not G. This is, verging on R in the ancient world. So that's a reason God's name is never mentioned in it. That's probably deliberate. The same is true of Song of Songs. I want to think about that. Oh, excuse me, so why is it in the canon, right? Let me ask and answer my own question. And I will tell you that it is in the canon because the rabbis who were looking at these texts already knew full well about the amount and extent of humor that is elsewhere all over the Bible. They already knew about that Viagra moment when Sarah says, come on, really? I'm going to have a child with him as old as he is? Come on, as old as he is? Right? They already knew that there was humor and that humor was a feature of biblical texts. And as a result, including the book of Esther would not have seemed so challenging for them. And also, this story does tell a story of triumph. At the point when these books were canonized, this was in response to the canonization of Christian scripture in the 4th century CE. Effectively, Jewish leaders finally thought, well, they're declaring what their sacred texts are. We better establish what ours are. And already by the 4th century CE, Jewish communities under the Christian Roman Empire knew what it was to be living under so many restrictions, whether they could build a temple, where they could build one if they could, where they could live, clothing they had to wear. So any story that was a story of triumph over power was going to be an attractive story to include in the canon. Do you understand what I'm saying there? Yeah, okay. All right, really important. This is the power and the proper function of comedy. This isn't about advising or giving you a moral lesson. The whole point is to be outrageous. That hat is outrageous, is it not? That's the point of that hat. I know Debbie is so disappointed that my Groucho Marx nose and glasses and mustache are at my university office, and I couldn't wear those today, but I promise I'll try to remember to bring them sometime for a future session, because being outrageous is kind of what I do too in this setting. So being outrageous is the function of this story. So let's take a look at some of the details. We have a 6-month-long party. It goes on for 180 days. Can you imagine a 180-day party? Just think about this. Who's bringing in the crops? Right? Like, it's completely absurd. There is no country that can sit down and party for 180 days. I promise you that is absurd. It is clearly at the beginning already absurd. The royal wine served in abundance at this next private party inside the palace. The text translation here is the rule was no restrictions. You could also translate that passage as, you know, the restrictions that were there were simply not observed. Why? Because everybody was probably too drunk to observe any restrictions by that point, right? Again, the story is giving you a space that is truly humorous and meant to be humorous and meant to be absurd, right? The Vashti's just say no moment, right? The queens of Persia, you know, are not even supposed to be hanging out in male settings. The story is, again, already setting up an idea that is absurd. That's why she has a party for her own ladies, a separate party, right? That's deliberate. So when the king insists that she come and show herself, he is completely violating protocol, and the people of the time of this story would have known that, would have known this is a violation of protocol. And of course, she does that thing which feminists for decades now have said, you know, the just say no idea was around before the just say no. Okay? And one of the really humorous moments in this is a deliberate move on the part of the biblical author. All of these names sort of sound a little Persian, but they're not real Persian names. They're made-up names, and they are meant to be tongue twisters. I dare any one of you to say those names fluidly and easily. Just try it. Right? And that is meant to happen. We repeatedly have in Esther a string of names of officials, a string of names in order to make the speaker stumble over the names themselves, in order to have yet another humorous moment where you are tongue-tied and you are having trouble articulating, right? Because that then evokes the laugh. And of course, what Vashti does is to refuse to come. And what is the response? I love that picture. I just want you to sit with that picture, right? Because women are dangerous. The ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will cite it to your majesty's officials, and there will be no end to scorn and provocation. The women are revolting. The women will rebel. The women will rise up and cause problems for us men. Now we're in serious trouble. This is a little domestic incident becoming a national crisis. And that is hilarious, right? The queen refuses to show up before the king, but this is going to have national repercussions. Men everywhere in Persia are now going to be facing recalcitrant, rebellious women. Oh my. So these officials are all over the place on this, right? They're freaking out over this. And what is their answer? Does anybody outside my star student genie remember what they do? What is their answer to this problem? Now I'm going to have to go back to Jeannie, right? No, wait. Ha ha. Dorothy knows. Yay.
Get rid of her and get another.
Yes. And before they do that, they do this. Oh, what the heck? Goodness me, that was exciting. There we go. Okay, we're back. An edict. Send out an edict. Every man should wield authority in his own home. You want to think about that. It's hilarious. And what's more, it is sent out in every single language spoken in Persia to make sure that every single man can say to his wife, I wield authority in this place. Right? I mean, it's so obviously ridiculous that we as readers have to laugh. And actually, this is one of the reasons the book of Esther has been seized on by feminists to say, oh, look, finally we see men being made fun of, and what does that give us, offer us, we women who so often in Bible are in some way subordinated or cast aside or denigrated in some way. In what way does this book actually empower rather than reduce women? And that is a feature of some readings of this book, though I can also tell you that there are issues there too, because these books always have other sides. They are, again, multivalent. Have I mentioned that word a few times? Multiple possible readings. So, for example, those same feminists have to deal with a fundamental problem here, which is that young girls are taken from all over the empire, ripped from their families, and brought to the king for what amounts to ancient sex slavery, right? So we have to think about the dark side of these stories too. Still, woman power and woman's voice are feared, but what is additionally ridiculous? Every one of the male characters who is supposedly the most powerful is told what to do by a woman. Ahasuerus, by the way, never ever makes his own decisions. People come to him and Haman says, hey, I'd like to kill the Jews. That's fine, here's my signet ring, right? Vashti refuses to come to the party. Esther tells him what to do later on. I mean, it's a constant, clear evidence that he is told what to do by everybody, but he is certainly told what to do by the women in his world. And so is Haman, whose wife also tells him, has some needling moments, if you're losing to Mordecai, you're in real trouble and you're doomed. Right? She's got this kind of snarky voice. But she's also right. He is doomed. He does die, right? And all of their sons. Mordecai is told what to do by Esther. He comes to her and says, you've got to go before the king. And she says, yeah, and the chances I'll lose my life. And he says, in actually one of the moving moments of Esther, why have you come to this time and this place if not for this moment, right? One of the most memorable moments for me in my whole rabbinic career was that right as I started rabbinical school, a dear friend of mine, a Christian friend of mine, who was the first person to bring me into a church in a way that made me feel safe, bought me a scarf made by a Christian artist on which the Hebrew letters were written, who knows if you have not come to the kingdom for just such a time as this. I still have that scarf, right? On Kings and Men, Ahasuerus, as I said, is all-powerful and simultaneously impotent, right? He never makes a single decision on his own. He is pushed around by every single other character in this story. Power is being laughed at. Power is being shown to be impotent. Power is being presented to you as capable of being demolished and diffused. One of the most important things about the book of Esther in Jewish tradition is its call to laugh at power. It is used every year to remind Jews, and was for 2,000 years, during a period of time in which Jews' movement was prescribed, their clothing was prescribed, what they could do for a living was prescribed, and their very lives were often hanging by a thread in Europe. Right? This book was used to let Jews have a moment every year to laugh at power. Right? To be able to say, Ahasuerus was a king who had power, and he lost his power in the face of Mordecai and Esther, and those who oppress us cannot always win either. Right? It was kind of a call to strength book. And it's still, in some respects, a reminder that power is fleeting. I think that's not a bad lesson for us to learn in our time about who has power and how they are using it, and the extent to which power is relying on bluster or pomp or big words and little deeds. Right? When do we see that functioning, and should we think about Ahasuerus and this book when we see that functioning? Oh, yes, excuse me, I forgot about this. This is the disadvantage of my not watching my own slides. So at the close of the story, do you remember what happens? Ahasuerus and Haman and Esther all at a meal. And Esther is asked by the king to name who is after her and her people, and she turns around and points directly at Haman. And Ahasuerus does something really quite peculiar, which is to get up and walk out of the room, right? Like, what? And then leave his wife with Haman. Haman falls on all fours, begging her to show mercy and sympathy. So he ends up kind of like Balaam does, on all fours, right? You know, in this subservient, clumsy position. Ahasuerus comes in and says, "You are ravishing my wife, and for this you shall die." Think about it. He cannot put Haman to death for his threats against the Jews, because he himself gave Haman the signet ring and the power to decree the death of the Jews. So walking out of the room and coming back and accusing Haman of ravishing his wife is the way he can get him. Yeah, it's really interesting and clever by the biblical author to present this in such a way that an impotent king has to get over his own impotence by setting up the other guy to fall on his face. Do you see what I'm saying here? Thank you, Debbie. I would not want to have skipped that. So just like Balaam, who ends up on all fours in front of the angel of the Lord. By the way, do we know what the angel of the Lord is called in the text of Numbers? Remember the angel of the Lord who stands in the way in front of Balaam and the donkey? Satan. Sometime I'll come in and talk to you about Satan, who does not exist in the Hebrew Bible as Satan or the devil, but does exist in the form of angels or human beings as an obstacle in the way of other characters. So the angel of the Lord here is a Satan. But Balaam ends up on all fours. I know, was that a little bit like, what? Okay, we need to do a session on this. Because I'm seeing a lot of, wait, what did she say? Wait, what? Okay. We'll do a session. And so, if we take a look at these incongruities, right? The 180-day party followed by yet another party. Just read the second one. Virgins dipped in oil for half a year and perfume for another half a year before being brought to the king, the dark side, right? But the whole beauty treatments piece is ridiculous. I mean, honestly, being dipped every day in oil for a year, people, is there anybody here who wants to try to put their clothing on after that experience? And how do they smell after a year, half a year of perfuming? You know, I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's meant to be silly. It's meant to make you laugh. It's meant to give you an idea of something that is absurd. Haman is hanged on a gallows that is higher than Solomon's temple. Oh, come on. Really? It's 5 stories high, this thing. Nobody's going to see him. Right? Again, the biblical author means to be making you laugh, means to set up something on stage that is impossible. I always imagine a gallows that goes up into the top of a stage where you can't even see it, and from way on, you know, on high, way up there, there's the voice of Haman. Because you couldn't see him if you built something anywhere near this high. And you want to think about how that might look. The darkest scene in the book, where Jews managed to kill, according to the text, almost 80,000 Persians without themselves taking a scratch. Again, how many men have been here in war, or women have been in war, and can testify that such a thing is possible? It isn't. So the very impossibility of it is implied in the statement that is being made, right? It's always and ever and repeatedly making a claim that cannot be true, that evokes the laughter, that makes you say, this is impossible, this is laughable, right? That's the whole point of burlesque. Remember the topsy-turvy movement of characters, the way masters become servants and servants become masters. Last week I told you that I frequently think of Mozart operas, where suddenly the servants are playing the role of the masters and the masters are playing the role of servants, usually in order to have sex with somebody. I mean, that's what's happening. That's Mozart. Right. So here, Haman's honor becomes Mordecai's. Do you remember what happens when the king has a sleepless night and looks in his records? Because, you know, how are you going to put yourself to sleep? Read bureaucratic documents. I promise you it will work. If I'm sitting around reading the documents that I have to go through before a department meeting, I will have trouble staying awake. No question about it. And that's what the king does. And so he finds this record that this dude, Mordecai, saved his life and exposed a plot to kill him. And Haman just wanders through the palace at that moment. That's how it reads. And the king says, oh, you, dude, who I have just elevated for no apparent reason to be important in my administration, what should we do with somebody who has rendered the king such a service? And Haman thinks it's him. And so he basically sets up a world in which he's going to be presented as if he were the king. He wears the royal clothing, the crown, he's on a horse. He thinks all this is going to happen to him. And of course, who does it happen to? Mordecai, right? At the end of it, the king says, yeah, okay, bring in Mordecai and have him like parade through the streets, more or less as me. Which is also, you kind of want to ask, like, King Ahasuerus, are you in your right mind? Weird, right? But that's what happens there. And Mordecai's end, the end that Haman set up for Mordecai, of course, becomes Haman's end. It's this topsy-turvy moment. There's a wonderful book by Timothy Beale where he describes the amount of reversals and changes, and even describes how you can see Vashti as a kind of Mordecai, and moves around these characters and shows how they overlap and have things in common. It's quite a lovely book, written back in the 1980s, but I'm still teaching it. It's just great stuff. All right, so who is who? Remember that in burlesque, people change their character, they change where they come from, they change who they are. Who's the insider? Who's the outsider? Haman appears to be the insider, pointing out the outsider, those Jews who don't follow the laws, right? This kind of, they have dual allegiances. If you are not noticing, by the way, that in our current political conversation, these very things are being said about Jews in this country. Have you noticed? I can see some people nodding their heads. If you have not noticed the way in which Jews are being presented as having doubled allegiances and therefore maybe not allegiant to the United States in the way that they should be because other things matter more to them. If you have not seen this, if you have not notice this, please start paying attention because it is in our political discourse and you are going to hear more of it as we move towards the election. You will hear it. And if you're not noticing, make me come back and then I will put on a PowerPoint all the ways in which we are seeing this, right? Or pointing them out. I mean, let me just give you an example. Josh Shapiro, who has recently been fingered as the Jewish governor of Pennsylvania. Hint, hint, he's Jewish governor of Pennsylvania, and therefore he has more than one allegiance. He's a Jew first, he's governor second. Do you understand what I'm saying? Please pay attention. It's making the world dangerous. And we're doing that kind of thing not only with Jews, but we've seen this kind of language around other groupings like people of color, immigrants, women, LGBTQ plus individuals. Watch that language because it's not much different from the kind of language we see Haman using in this book. Haman is himself in diaspora. He himself is an Amalekite. Remember the Amalekites who came from behind to strike the Israelites down as they left Egypt? He's a Persian minister appointed by the king. Is he an insider? Is he an outsider? What position does he really hold? And who does he become? Sort of, right? Because he almost steps into the role of king in that moment when he tells the king how to reward someone who has been helpful to him. He effectively tries to impersonate the king, right? So you want to think about all the ways in which his character Mordecai, who is outside of the city gates, then inside the city gates, where Mordecai is located, says something about insider, outsider roles, and then elevated to the kind of position of power at the end that he has. Again, Esther. What is it we see here? Did we see ridicule? Is the king ridiculed? He is. Is Haman ridiculed? He is. Is there caricature? Absolutely. This king is a buffoon. Men who are his courtiers, who are issuing edicts so that other men can be certain to tell their women who's in charge, are buffoons. Their names are ridiculous and funny. Identity confusion. Who is who and who plays what role? Esther is an insider. Is she an outsider? When does she reveal herself? When is she known? Everybody knows she's related to Mordecai, but somehow people in the palace haven't figured out that she's Jewish. What the hell? What? Really? Okay, role reversals we've just talked about. Ludicrous treatment of serious topics like death and war. Did we see that with the story of Isaac last week, right? All of these things are characteristics of this narrative. So, I think I'm going to end by saying this about the book of Esther and about humor in the Hebrew Bible. We are indeed, in this country, bereft of the humor we need. We are desperately in need of lightness, of joy, of laughter. We have faced much, and we have gone through much. We are just barely out of the worst pandemic we've had in 100 years. We are just barely out of incidents of violence and fear in our nation's capital. We are just barely out and past so much trauma. And I think it's not over yet. So I encourage you to look around the room. Every person in this room loves you, and you love every person in this room. At least you like them, or you wouldn't be sitting here with them. When I came to this church this morning, I mentioned something about a dear friend of mine who belongs to this church. And I said, well, she's this, she's that, she's the other thing. And my husband, who unfortunately couldn't be with us this morning because he had an errand to run, said, she's about community. That's what she does. He knows less about her than I do. And he's right. You have a room full of people who are about community, who are about building community and creating community and having a safe community. Laugh with each other. Thank you. Have we got questions or comments? We will move this. Okay, Debbie's going to start. Yeah, you know, I'm just going to reveal who that person was I was speaking about. Would you please stand up, Debbie? You all know how much she is about this community.
Thank you. 2 questions. One is a tiny little specific about the text, and one is about a broader thing that you said. When Vashti was brought in, it says she came in wearing her diadem.
She was supposed to. She didn't come. She refused.
Okay, but it says something about her diadem, and I wondered if that was her way of saying, I have power. I'm wearing a crown.
Okay, second question. And then
Okay. You said that this text is used annually to give your community hope for overcoming power. Is that Purim? When is, okay.
Yes, that is indeed Purim. Okay, so the first thing is, of course, Vashti doesn't come. She's supposed to come with that diadem. And yes, you can read that in 2 ways. Now, she's ordered to show up with the diadem. So that means she's ordered to show up with a certain presentation of her power. And you can read that as acknowledging the power she has, or you can read that as the king demonstrating his power over the other power. Right? Yes, Purim is a celebration that happens every year. One of the interesting things that Jews are required to do is the only time. I mean, I grew up in a world that for the most part wasn't particularly fond of alcohol, partly because, and I am one of those Jews that inherited sort of like the indigenous people have, you know, sort of sensitivity to alcohol. Give me 2 sips of it and I'm out. So I just don't bother anymore because I'm not reliable after that. And there's too much work to do in the world, right? But on that holiday, we're supposed to drink until we cannot tell the difference between the name Haman and Mordecai, according to the rabbis, right? And that should make you kind of like go, whoa, what? And I think that's because one of the lessons of this story is how quickly that turnaround occurs between good and evil, between power and lack thereof, and that when we know that we can't always tell the difference, we learn humility. Really important. Now, do I believe we have to get smashed to do that, like drunk? No. So I don't do that part of it. But I do try to remember the lesson of humility. Okay, who else? And I'll be happy to bring the microphone around too. Comment, question, do. No, I'm going the wrong way.
I was just wondering where this story originated. This is obviously not meant to be like historical record, but where did it come from?
Teacher gets happy. Such a good question. Such a good question. And this was a slide I took out because I was worried about time. But there was a slide on Greek comedy of the time. Esther is written between the 4th and 3rd century BCE. And it shows an amazing amount of features that are also up in the Hellenistic world, particularly when it comes to making fun of Persia. Right? The same kinds of trope around the excesses of Persia, the drinking in Persia, the parties in Persia. And at the time that this was written, there was like this really incredible bestseller list of stories about courtiers who never could make it up to the top and somehow magically end up doing it. There's a version of the Joseph story called Joseph and Asenath that's written about the same time. And these same stories often have, really important queens in them playing a critical role. So Esther is also part of a larger context. Its author is certainly well conversant with these Greek narratives. There are all sorts of signs in the text of how conversant that author was. What a lovely question. So Jeannie and Katie and Debbie